lectures, we introduced the context of Africa in terms of thinking about Rome and the importance of looking at North Africa in light of Rome and the context and the connection between these two cities in the ancient world. And now we're going to turn more specifically to Africa itself. So in this lecture, I want to begin by thinking about the definition of Africa. When we say Africa in early Christianity, what are we talking about and what are we not talking about? So Africa defined. What are we talking about with Africa in the ancient world? Today, if you say Africa, people think of the entire continent. Obviously, in terms of early Christianity, we're not talking about the entire continent of Africa. We're talking about what the Romans called Africa. And the Romans called Africa a very particular part of the northern coast of the continent. So if we look at the map here, this is the map we saw in a previous lecture with the division of the empire into 4 parts. And here we have along the north coast Africa, which stretches from modern-day Libya through Tunisia, Algeria, and really all the way over to modern-day Morocco. So we're talking about Africa in this period. We're talking about this entire region across the north coast of Africa, which many people are surprised to find out was Christian. And for a long time, it was, in fact, Christian. So we're talking about this region, and obviously here is Carthage, and the other city that's marked on the map is Hippo. And we'll talk about Augustine. This is where Augustine serves as bishop. So we're talking about this particular part of Africa. If we look at a closer map of the region, it divides it into the 4 actual regions. For the sake of the Romans, there were actually subdivisions of this part of the world. So Africa proper is this purple area, and you had Numidia and some other provinces farther to the west. And so here sits Carthage, and Carthage is the main city of this entire part. In the same way that Rome had some importance in Italy, more broadly, Carthage is the city that really is most important in this part of the ancient world and of the ancient Christian world. We talked about how Carthage actually ruled this entire part of the world for much of its early history. And so when we're thinking about Christian history as well, Carthage plays an important role, not just in the area right around Carthage, but for all of this part of Africa. So back to this map again. I want us to pay attention to where Africa is, and I'm going to show you a couple of maps about the overall history of Christianity in the long sense, and I want us to keep our eyes on this part of the world to see how it plays in. So this first map that I'm showing you comes from the Atlas of Global Christianity, and this shows the Christian expansion by around the year 100. And it may be a little bit hard to see on the screen, but the difference of between white and yellow may be very difficult to pick up. But in this part of around the Mediterranean, there's a slight yellowing. And this shows that there was as the key shows, a very, very small minority of Christians. But this part of Africa, this northern part of Africa, is yellow. In the same way that Greece is yellow, parts of Turkey are yellow, Italy is yellow. It's a little hard to see in this first map. This second map shows Christian expansion by around the year 500. And as the extent of Christianity gets greater in a region, it begins to turn blue. And the darker the blue, the more Christian the region was believed to be. And here you can see this part of Africa now much more clearly, a darker color of blue. Italy and Greece are darker blue than Africa is, but you can see by around the year 500, this is clearly a Christian region. This map shows, as best as scholars can estimate it, what is the statistical center of global Christianity. That is, if you took all the Christians in the world, plotted them all, and then shrunk it down to one point on the face of the earth, where is the geographical center of Christianity? And so notice in 33, it's in Jerusalem, which makes sense. And so the number moves across time in generally a large arc, where now the estimate is by 2100, the global center of Christianity is going to be actually toward the center of Africa. But notice this arc circles around one particular region. Here it is. Here's Africa. So if we think of Africa as being on the edge of Christianity or outside Christianity, all the data actually shows us the opposite. That it is true that now this part of the world is predominantly Muslim. But historically speaking, this part of the world has never been far from the center of Christianity. and has always been, in some ways, certainly in the early period, connected to Christianity. And so historically now, people think of this as a Muslim area, which it is. But historically, for the sake of our course, we're going to see how this was crucial to the early development of Christianity. And in fact, another example of why it's not on the edge of the world, the sea in the middle here, we call the Mediterranean Sea. In fact, let me go back to this map. The Mediterranean Sea. Mediterranean, if you know Latin, means in the middle of the land. So this sea is in the middle of the land, which means that Rome sits on the north side of the sea that's in the middle of the land. Carthage sits on the south side of the sea that's in the middle of the land. So Africa is not on the edge of the Roman world. Africa is not on the edge of the early Christian world. Africa and Carthage, it's as much at the center as Rome is. It's around the sea. The Romans also called this our sea. And on the southern edge of our sea sat Carthage. So this part of the world, it's important to understand where it fits historically. Obviously, since I'm in Egypt, I'll point out there's Egypt. And many people know about the importance of Egypt in the history of Christianity, perhaps less so about this part of Africa. Okay, Africa described. I want to lay out for you a few basic themes that we're going to be talking about specifically in the lectures, but these themes will show up again and again in the readings. It's not that these are unique elements of Africa necessarily, but they're very important African elements. So we're going to talk about martyr traditions, we're going to talk about the response to persecution, and we're going to talk about some important authors. Authors who were important not just for Africa, but for all of Christian history. So I'll briefly introduce these now, but then over the next couple lectures we're going to be coming back to these in more detail. So let's think about martyr traditions for just a few minutes, and I'll mention a few stories that we're going to be talking about. Perhaps the most famous of all North African martyrs are Perpetua and Felicity, who die around the year 202 or 203. It's difficult to have the precise date. And here's one image of Perpetua and Felicity being bored or being mauled by a bull. As we read in the story, it wasn't an easy thing. It wasn't simple to kill martyrs. We have lots of accounts of martyrs who have 3 or 4 or 5 things happen to them before they actually die. But in a later lecture, we're going to be talking specifically about Perpetua and Felicity. Another famous martyr from North Africa is Cyprian, the bishop, who dies in the year 258 under one of the most vicious of all persecutions of early Christians that happens in North Africa in the early part of, or the middle part of the 3rd century in the 250s. The Cyprian of Carthage, we'll talk about his history, his story, his martyrdom. And because martyrdom occurred so often in North Africa, the idea of suffering, the notion of suffering becomes central to Christian identity in Africa. This is true in other places, but it seems to be especially true in Africa. And we have indications of this in the writings of Tertullian. Also, Origen suggests this, a very similar idea in Egypt, that suffering is central to Christian identity. A true Christian suffers. Jesus died on the cross. He suffered. Paul said, imitate me as I'm imitating Christ. And Paul died as a martyr. So Paul is basically telling Christians, you should do what I'm doing. Imitate Christ in your suffering. So true Christians suffer. And in fact, suffering and martyrdom becomes one of the signs of legitimacy. How do you know who is a true Christian? Or in the case of the Donatist controversy that we're going to talk about, how do you know which church is legitimate? Which bishop is legitimate? Well, look for those who have suffered. Those who refuse to suffer or those who run away from suffering are not legitimate. So there's a direct connection between suffering and legitimacy in the African church. Okay, a second theme is the response to persecution. How should Christians respond to persecution? And we're going to focus on two particular periods of persecution, the two most intense periods of persecution, of sustained persecution in early Christianity. And we're going to see how the Africans respond to it and what particular issues are raised because of these issues of persecution. In the time of Cyprian, in the 250s, we know he dies in 258, but before his death, there are already problems for the church in Africa. Because during the persecution, some people were given the option of death or of basically honoring the emperor or offering a sacrifice in honor of the emperor. Some Christians offered the sacrifice in honor of the emperor in order to save their lives. Well, when the persecution is over, what do you do with these people? Are they welcome back in the church or not? What do they have to do to come back into the church? Cyprian has to sort this out. He has a church community where some people think if you gave up your faith in persecution, you gave up your faith forever, and you can never come back. And there are other people in the church who say, no, we should welcome them back, we should forgive them. And Cyprian has a very difficult task of trying to bring the church to some kind of consensus on how they should deal with people who during the persecution seem to have given in to the pressure. And the other period of persecution is the Great Persecution, during the period of Diocletian. After this, we have the Donatist controversy. And it's somewhat related to what happened to Cyprian, but the issue with the Donatist controversy has more to do with the bishops themselves. In the period of persecution, as we'll see, the bishops are forced to make a choice. Give us your sacred books or give us your lives. So it's your book or your life. And the account suggests that some bishops choose to hand over the books. In fact, in some cases, they gave over books that weren't even sacred texts. They just gave some book to these illiterate soldiers to save their lives, thinking that they were more important than the books. But after the persecution is over, some Christians say they're no longer legitimate bishops. And anyone they ordained is not a legitimate bishop. And the Donatist controversy has to do with who can be a legitimate bishop and what do you do with those who seem to have given in to the pressure of persecution. And there are different opinions, those who say they can be forgiven and those who say they cannot be forgiven. And a third theme that we're going to talk about in these lectures is a focus on some of the important authors, not just for Africa, but for all of Christianity. African authors, African thinkers, African theologians without question, shaped Christian thought in general, for all Christians. And we're going to talk about three of these important authors. One is Tertullian. Tertullian, a North African, seems to be from Carthage, who is an apologist, that is someone who writes with an explanation or a defense of Christianity, but also a theologian. He talks about the Trinity, about the doctrine of God. He talks about the importance of baptism, and his theology is foundational for those who come later. He also talks about martyrdom and suffering and persecution. So he covers a lot of the areas that are important not just to African Christians, but to all Christians. We'll look at some of his works in detail. Cyprian is another one. And Cyprian is less a theologian than really a pastor and a bishop. So a lot of Cyprian's writings are letters where he's dealing with particular issues. So Cyprian doesn't give us an apology or maybe a systematic theology in the way Tertullian does, but Cyprian gives us more of what we might see with the Apostle Paul's letters in the New Testament. Very particular letters about very particular issues. If you think about the New Testament, Paul seldom stops and says, here is my general theology. What Paul gives us is letters dealing with this issue or that issue. How do we respond to this? And those practical letters that Paul provides with a theological basis are very important for the development of the early church. And Cyprian gives us a similar kind of literature, letters dealing with issues that the church is actually facing. And then the most famous author from Africa is Augustine. And Augustine wears many hats, as we say. He does a lot of things. And Augustine was certainly important in his time, and the church thought that he was important enough that they preserved a large percentage of his writings. I think sometimes that we can overestimate how much Augustine was important in his own day versus other authors, because so much more of his writing survives. I think that can give us perhaps a skewed idea of how important he was. At the same time, the fact that the church preserves so many of his writings tells us he was important. So we're going to look at some of his theological writings, some of his personal writings, really his personal autobiography, the Confessions, which is, in my mind, one of the great works of literature in the Western tradition, period. One of the most important works ever written in the Latin language is Augustine's Confessions, not as a work of theology per se, but as a work of autobiography that is theological at the same time. But we'll also talk about some of his theological writings and Augustine as a pastor, Augustine as a bishop. Just because he was Augustine doesn't mean that everything went well. And many of his sermons, he's frustrated. He's frustrated that people aren't coming to church, which is a familiar issue. He's frustrated that people aren't doing what they're supposed to be doing. Augustine is the bishop in North Africa when the city of Rome is overthrown in the year 410. And people are saying, how can God let Rome be overthrown by barbarians? And he writes The City of God to try to explain to people the city of earth and the city of God. How do we understand history? How do we understand the movements of history in light of what God is doing on a more eternal level? So these three main issues, martyrdom, the response to persecution, and these important authors, are going to take up much of our time in the coming lectures. So let me pause and ask if there are any questions about laying out the general perspective on what we're talking about with Africa, or the general issues that we're going to be talking about as we go forward.
Is it true, putting it in the later context with the fall of North Africa, that these distinct approaches moved into areas like Ireland and the and England and that part of Europe to influence the development of Christianity there rather than from Rome?
So these distinct elements in terms of...
especially in respect of the monasteries in Egypt and all those ideas going through.
Okay.
What I'm trying to arrive at is, are we looking at two streams of theology?
Rome and Africa?
Yeah.
Yeah, so the question is about, are we looking at different streams of theology, Rome and Africa, and how this relates to what happens later in Ireland and maybe in the UK now, yes. Well, there are elements to suggest, there are artistic elements that strongly suggest Egyptian influence on Irish monasticism. And scholars go back and forth arguing this, but if we look at some of the artwork in the manuscripts in medieval Ireland, and we look at the artwork in some of the early manuscripts in Egypt, the similarities are striking.
Right.
And is it possible that they both independently came up with the same artistic elements? It's possible, but I think there's the evidence suggests that not just the ideas of monasticism from the north coast of Africa, especially Egypt, not just the ideas, but actually the art itself does seem to travel up to the corner of the world, really, up to Ireland.
Yeah.
So that, some scholars have looked into this, and there's still some debate about it, but certainly the life of Africa and African theology doesn't seem to end there.
But is Egypt distinct from North Africa?
Is Egypt distinct from North Africa? In this period, yes and no. No in the sense that as much as Tertullian and Augustine are taking part in the discussion that's influencing all of Christianity, obviously Egypt's involved with that. But there is a linguistic difference, that North Africa is Latin speaking and Egypt is Greek speaking. Right. So certainly if you asked someone in Carthage how important is Africa, or is Egypt, they would certainly understand the importance of Egypt. If you ask someone in Egypt how important Africa was, they might say, well, Antioch is more important to us, or Constantinople is more important to us, or Jerusalem. So I think Egypt really is more primarily interested in the eastern part, the Greek-speaking part of the world, than maybe Africa itself, and the western part, the Latin-speaking part of Africa. There is some connection there, but Carthage doesn't get involved in a lot of the debates with the Eastern churches in the way that, say, Rome does.
Can I pose a second question?
Yes, yes.
Coming to North Africa specifically, is the population there affected by Christianity, the entire population, or is it a colonial population?
Okay, so the question is, if we look, let me go back to a map here. If we're looking at North Africa, let's get back to this map, is the entire population, how much does Christianity penetrate the population? Or is it primarily a colonially imposed religion? The evidence seems to suggest that it penetrates fairly deep into the population, because one of the elements in the Donatist controversy particularly is you have Carthage, the official church in Carthage, with a bishop who's recognized by the emperor. But you have a lot of bishops in these more rural areas, and a lot of people, it appears, in the more rural areas who are really standing up against that. So if you look at the Donatist controversy, the two different divisions, there's the one side that's recognized by the imperial government, and that seems to be a minority in terms of the population. The vast majority of the population of Africa seems to support the rival bishop. And so we have evidence of churches scattered throughout this whole region into the rural areas as well. So it doesn't appear that Christianity in Africa is just for the large cities. It appears that it does penetrate deeply into the populations out into the countryside.